Hello, thank you for joining today's webinar. Today's webinar is sponsored by Index Engines and Alvarez and Marsal. The topic is GDPR, one of everybody's favorite topics of the day. It's really talking from a different angle, talking about how to fund a GDPR strategy from an existing budget. My name is Jim McGann. I'm VP of Marketing here at Index Engines. I will be presenting, and I am happy to be joined by Pavel Treskin. He is a director with Alvarez and Marsal's Disputes and Investigation Practice and part of their information governance team. Pav works with global clients across financial services, telco, retail, and pharmaceutical, and with stakeholders including legal, records management, compliance, privacy, IT, information security, and individual business units. His primary area of focus are information governance, legacy data cleanup, and GDPR. Welcome, Pav. Thanks for joining us today.
Thanks, Jen. Hello, everyone. And once again, thank you for joining our webinar today. So as we all know, the GDPR is coming into effect in May 2018. Probably worth reiterating that it will have a major effect on how companies collect and process personal information pertaining to all EU individuals. But its reach goes well beyond the borders of the member states. It's going to have a global effect. Any entity that stores or processes the personal data of any EU individual will be immediately obliged to conform to the new law, regardless of where they reside. So ultimately, they face the consequences moving forward. So we're going to be talking for the next 30 minutes or so, and we'll be talking about how and different ways to help organizations fund a GDPR project, as Jim mentioned. One area in particular focus will be how GDPR has become one of the new major drivers for implementing a strong information governance framework. So IG, in essence, is about maximizing the value of information while minimizing the risks and the costs that are associated with managing it. So the costs that are being saved by practicing good information governance can then be used to help fund projects, including GDPR. So organizations are accumulating and storing more data than ever before. According to the Gartner Group, data is growing anywhere between 40 to 60% year on year. So for enterprises to successfully manage this exponential growth, they must first understand what data they have across the enterprise and how it's going to affect their operations. So gaining that knowledge is the first step towards developing an IG strategy, as well as becoming GDPR compliant moving forward. In most cases, achieving GDPR compliance within organizations basically comes across as being unattainable. Most of the organizations that I'm speaking with currently, because it can be a transfer, or for all intents and purposes, it is a transformational type of process. So where should organizations start? And this is a reoccurring theme as far as questions that I'm given. So initially, the key is for organizations to perform a current state assessment. So understand where they are and identify which areas have the highest risk. So in essence, drawing a line in the sand and determining what stage of maturity are they currently in, and where do they need to go in order to improve moving forward and to go throughout the stages as far as maturity is concerned. The actual levels as far as maturity range from the chaotic through to the fully mature and optimized process. So having this initial assessment means that a set of initiatives can be established to move the organization to its desired sort of end state, if you will. So in my experience, most companies I'm dealing with are still in the chaotic and embryonic stages, still trying to figure out what type of data they have and where the data exists. And one of the biggest challenges companies are facing, and in my experience, is in regards to unstructured data. So in essence, data that's created by employees, clients, PowerPoint presentations, Excel spreadsheets, Word, emails, of course, etc. So according to a report from Forrester Group, approximately 80% of the enterprise's storage footprint consists of unstructured data. So if you think about all the different types of data across the enterprise, all the file shares, all the SharePoints, all the emails that are scattered throughout, a lot of this data has not been accessed for years. So what are the potential risks that are associated with this data? This is like one of the questions that definitely keeps Chief Information Security Officers awake at night. So next slide, please, Jen. So why is it important? So from an information governance perspective, from a GDPR perspective, I was talking about the exponential growth as far as data is concerned. It's just no longer feasible to simply store this data. It has far too much cost associated to it, as well as far too much risk associated to it. 70% of information has no business value. The CGOC, the Compliance and Governance Oversight Council, did a survey and approached organizations across different vertical industries and asked them, what type of unstructured data do you have? And typically, about 1% of data is on legal hold. About 5% of that data is used for regulatory purposes. Probably about 25% of it has some type of business value, and that leaves approximately 70% of it that has no business value at all. So why are organizations still keeping this data? 1% of increase in annual IT budget, if organizations are lucky. And typically, from an IT budget, probably about 20% of that is allocated towards storage. So if an organization can reduce those costs significantly, it's going to have a major effect as far as the bottom line is concerned. One of the areas that's getting probably the most recognition as far as GDPR are data breaches. So there's no lack of examples as far as organizations that are currently talking about or having to divulge that their organization has been breached and records have been breached. Probably the biggest example currently would be Equifax. So if you think initially they reported 143 million records that were breached. Just recently, they've realized that there's an additional 2.5 million records. I believe out of those, close to 700,000 are from the UK. Also, about 200,000 records had credit card information that was associated to as well. So we're all very familiar as to sort of the teeth that GDPR has as far as a regulation is concerned and the types of fines that are associated, 20 million euros or 4% of the global turnover, whichever is higher. But you also have to take in consideration the internal costs. There was a paper that was put out by the Poneman Group, and they were calculating that each data breach, as far as an organization is concerned, is up to $144. So you definitely, with sort of using Equifax as an example, you would most definitely have to take out a calculator to figure out the actual costs that are associated with that type of breach. And not only are there costs, but as far as the reputational damage that is created, and the fact that the regulators will be auditing this organization on a regular basis moving forward as well, which is going to be incredibly disruptive. Next slide, please. So how do organizations then go about driving down the costs and the risks associated with data and ultimately be able to take some of those savings and start to fund other projects like GDPR moving forward? Redundant, obsolete, trivial information. A lot of you probably heard of ROTS, which is the acronym. And going back to the slide where I mentioned about 70%, excuse me, of data has no business value. This is really what it's comprised of as far as the redundant, obsolete, and trivial. in my experience, probably about 20 to 40% of that information that has no business value is trivial. So not only doesn't it have business value, but it's never had business value. So typically, the older that data becomes, the less value it has. The trivial information is actually, as I mentioned, the data that has never had any value. So for example, someone saving their wedding album photographs on a shared drive or iTunes libraries. I was part of a project a while back, speaking of iTunes libraries, and it was an insurance company, and we found out that an employee was saving her iTunes library to a shared drive. She didn't realize, though, that this was being duplicated, it was being replicated, it was being copied. We were able to calculate at the end of the day that it was costing the organization about $35,000 a year to actually store this information. And this is kind of an extreme example, but this is one person in an organization of 8,000 employees. So there's definitely savings to be made with regards to being able to identify this type of information and action it accordingly. So the PII, the personally identifiable information, again, going back to sort of losing sleep as far as the CISOs are concerned, or legal or compliance, this information is scattered across the wild, and it's really important to be able to have some type of ability to have a like 360-degree view, if you like, of the different types of data sources, to be able to identify this type of information and to be able to classify it accordingly moving forward. A couple of other different types of use cases as far as data migrations are concerned. In my experience, data migration is more of a lift and shift, in the sense that if you're moving data to another de facto enterprise content management system, or to the cloud for that matter, as opposed to just sort of moving all the data, being able to actually understand what that data is, what it is to begin with, to be able to classify it accordingly, and then to be able to move it based on its value, based on its whether it's sensitive information, whether it's highly confidential information. Mergers and acquisitions, divestitures, again, not knowing what type of data an organization has and then sort of passing it on. It could be IP, they could be toxic assets. So really stressing the point on how imperative it is for organizations to really start to understand what type of information they have. We have early case assessments here as well, and from a litigation perspective, probably the most expensive part of any litigation would be the review process. And again, when there's a matter and an organization needs to collect the data, in my experience, once again, they tend to send over a dump of data or all the data, as opposed to being able to, if you understand the data, if it's been classified accordingly, then being able to send only what's relevant. So there's a stat as far as the costs for review is concerned, and I believe it's about $18,000 for a gigabyte. So being able to reduce that cost by sending the lawyers and the paralegals information that's only relevant to a matter is going to help reduce costs significantly as well. I guess defensible deletion, this is something that Jim is going to talk about in a little more detail, the holy grail, if you will, as far as information governance is concerned. And going back to the maturity model that I showed, which is basically, I sort of focused it on GDPR, but it's a takeoff as far as information governance maturity model. But really what organizations are trying to do is get from a manual sort of position where they are to automating the process moving forward. And eventually, being in a position when, as the data is coming in, it's being classified and then it's being stored accordingly automatically. So I think on that note, I'm going to pass it over to Jim, who's going to talk a little more about some of the challenges that organizations are facing and basically how they're going about trying to solve these moving forward.
Thanks, Pav. I appreciate that. That was a great introduction. So Index Engines partner with Alvarez to help customers really kind of meet the demands of GDPR. So the challenges that we're seeing is really kind of falls into three different buckets. One, really the extreme data volumes. There's a large amount of user content that exists out in the network, and as Pav mentioned, some of it has zero value. Some of it could be toxic or present a risk, and some of it is just normal working files that would contain personal content that needs to be managed. But the scale of it is in massive numbers, reaching billions and billions of files across complex infrastructure. So the volumes are significant. The complexity of the infrastructure is not really designed to provide this level of knowledge and insight into the data. So in addition to files that are sitting on networks, you've got data sitting in archives like SharePoint, for example. You've got email in email databases. You've got even backup data. They're all proprietary, complex repositories where personal data that's relevant to this new regulation could be hidden. And finally, one of the common issues that we see every day are budgets and the tools. Organizations do not have the tools to be able to provide this level of knowledge and management of the content, and it's really not something that had been budgeted. No one really knows, if you had to put a budgetary number down a year ago or 2 years ago to support GDPR, what would it be? It's just impossible to really figure out what the financial impact is. So what we're talking about today is how to manage your data in those large environments, in those complex repositories, and really kind of recoup some of the expenses that are already being paid to manage that content and apply it towards the GDPR. So this slide is fairly complex, but it's really a simplified view of the world of most data sources. So what Index Engines is really architected is really a workflow to support this regulatory policy. The main focus is to obviously reduce the risk and manage according to the new regulation, but also to control costs. And we've been finding that customers can, by controlling costs, can really help support the regulation with money that's already being spent. So if we look here on the left in terms of data sources, there's a wide number of data sources that exist out there on the network or on your data center. So obviously network data, that's really the most common, is you've got your file shares, your servers, and so on. That's the stuff where everybody's storing their common files. As I mentioned, email servers, Microsoft Exchange, Lotus Notes are the dominant players in the space today. Archive, SharePoint, things like Enterprise Vault, where data is archived and preserved. And then the backup data, backup catalogs, and legacy backup tapes. So, backup tapes and backup data is really being used for disaster recovery, but that data is being archived in offsite storage vaults for long-term retention. Not a great practice that we see out there, because as they age and sit out in those salt mines to be preserved for forever and ever, there's really no insight into what exists. So Index Engines provides a tool, a solution that provides that level of insight into this content. And what we provide really is a unified search and reporting against all these different data sources. So our solution can index data at a very large scale, so in the petabyte class, so billions and billions of files, whether they exist on network servers, email servers, archives like SharePoint, or even legacy backup data. So provide that unified view so organizations understand what they have. And as Pav mentioned, a lot of customers are looking at that content and classifying it. So classifying it into different buckets. And that's the key to really supporting the regulation, is really to understand what you have, put it in these different buckets, and classify it according to certain categories such as rot data. As Pav mentioned, rot data could be a significant volume of what exists on there. That's just taking up space. It's creating it's creating noise, it's creating clutter that makes managing through the regulation very complicated. It clearly has no business value. It's data that could be log files. As Pav mentioned, that one case, it could be personal content like iTunes libraries or vacation photos. Cleaning that up and cleaning that data out of the network. And organizations are typically surprised how much of that rot data exists. We've seen anywhere from 30 upwards of 50% of the content that exists on the network is rot data. The second bucket is, in terms of classification, is out of scope data. So data that's out of scope for GDPR regulations and policies. So it could be users that are on the network that would deal with personal data of customers. It could be file types. You know, maybe presentations would never have any personal information in them. It could be types of files like that could be ruled as out of scope, and that could be a significant chunk of the content. And then finally, in-scope data. This is really the key focal area for the regulation. This is the kind of content that exists out there. So maybe Excel spreadsheets or Word documents created by the finance or the legal teams. That's the stuff that needs to be searched. So what we found in this in-scope data is this can represent typically a small volume, possibly about 10% of the data that exists out there within your data center. So finding and classifying this content is key to supporting this regulation, and then developing these data policies. So rot data, we've seen customers purge that content, just get rid of it. If you can't get rid of it, there's very low cost cloud storage, cold storage that it could be archived in just to get it out of the data center and out of the scope for any kind of GDPR requests. The data that's out of scope, that really doesn't have personal content, that's really not active any longer, the stuff that's aged that no one's using, migrated off premise out to the cloud is going to be significantly less expensive to manage that going forward. The stuff that's out of scope but still being active, you can ignore it when you have a GDPR request. So just get that out of your site in terms of any kind of query. The stuff that's in scope here, anything that's in scope that's not being actively used, you can migrate that out to a vault or a secure archive that's easily searched and managed. If it's in scope and it's being actively used, you can monitor it in place so you know exactly where it is when the queries come into play. So we've architected, and there's a guidebook that we'll present at the end of this that you can download, a workflow that totally makes sense to support this demanding regulation, and it really simplifies. It takes really a massive mountain of data and makes it into a manageable molehill, so to speak. So in terms of the theme of today's session is how do you fund this GDPR activity using existing budget? So the key is that there's significant volumes of data that's being managed. So being able to determine the active versus the inactive content is really key. So as I mentioned, there's three buckets. So the current inactive stuff that has value, determine what that is. Not as difficult as you would think. You could look at metadata fields saying, look, show me files that have been accessed in the last few years. Show me stuff that's being used by the legal teams. Maybe the legal team wants to have all documents or PDFs actively and available online, so keep those. And then look at those other categories like the age and obsolete data. So basically based on certain metadata fields like stuff that hasn't been accessed. Migrate that stuff from the data center. As Pav mentioned earlier, ROT analysis, or the redundant, obsolete, trivial content, is a very popular activity in support of the GDPR. Obviously, the GDPR doesn't mandate a ROT analysis or ROT cleanup, but it definitely clears the playing field and allows the ROT or GDPR requests or GDPR queries to occur much more easily, especially since ROT can be significant. So how does ROT turn into ROI, or how does ROT help fund GDPR? If you look here, this is some data based on a number of the projects that we have been involved with. If you look at a specific client, so this one client had 500 terabytes on a user share. A number of different analyst firms out there will cite the fully loaded cost of managing a petabyte of storage. The number I'm using here is $1 million to manage a petabyte of data in the data center. So if you look at the comparison of these different classification buckets that I mentioned earlier, you look at active data, the stuff that people are using, that's typically a small percentage. So on average, we're seeing 20, 25% of the data that's actively being used. So that should be remaining in place and being monitored. The inactive data that has no activity, no one's accessing it, should really be moved out of the data center to lower cost cloud storage. So lower cost cloud storage is significantly lower than $1 million a year for a petabyte. So that could be upwards of 30%. The sensitive content that's out there that really shouldn't be out in the network and available to users could be archived in the cloud and preserved for legal. And then rot, very commonly see a number of 40%. That stuff could be either purged, as I mentioned earlier, or in this case, I'm going to use a number of moving it to cold storage. So if you look at business as usual, as I mentioned, 500 terabytes would be about $500,000 a year to manage that in the data center. You can see the different categories. By migrating it and taking advantage of cloud storage, that whole transformed environment is reduced to about $156,000 annually. So you can see here, 31% cost savings in 1 year. Over 3 years, you're saving over $1 million in data center expenses. So the fact that you're using the platform, the Index Engines platform, to classify and manage data and make it searchable to support not only the data cleanup, which will save over $1 million over 3 years, and this is only for half a petabyte. It's not a large volume of data. So the impact if you expand this beyond just half a petabyte would be significant. We're involved with a project on the West Coast with an electronics manufacturing firm that did the same effort only on 2.5 petabytes. So it was 5 times what we're talking about here today. And their cost savings were in the multi-millions of dollars in terms of what they saw saving by doing rot cleanup and managing that legacy content. So the fact is that you can provide solutions to the data center, to the IT organizations that would help them recoup significant expense, pay for the effort, and also pay for the GDPR compliance. So with that said, a short introduction on Index Engines. Again, we are a software company that are working with Alvarez to help customers do basically 3 things: know what they have, manage it accordingly, and apply governance and policy to the data. So we provide data classification and profiling tools that provide that level of knowledge to know what you have and develop these classification buckets, as I mentioned earlier. It also provides very detailed search into the content to find personal data, whether it be keyword or concept search or pattern search. All the search tools are there that you can find even the most complex data in the most demanding environments. We provide integrated defensible disposition to be able to migrate, delete, defensively delete, archive and preserve data. Full audit trails of all that activity exists, so it's fully defensible. We've been involved with lots of legal discovery or rediscovery cases, so it's a full defensible process. And then we have automation monitoring built in. So for the data protection officer, there's a lot of tools to provide ongoing management that's fully auditable to be able to provide instant access to personal data as required. So I'm going to pass it back to Pav to talk a little bit about some of the solutions and capabilities that Alvarez provide to help support this activity.
Thanks, Jim. So yeah, just wanted to sort of, I guess, carry on for where Jim has been discussing and talking to the technology, and the technology is definitely a very important aspect as far as any information governance or GDPR exercise. In order for a project to be successful moving forward, it's really a combination as far as the people, the processes, and the technology. Going back to sort of, where do you start? We're helping organizations really do the initial types of assessment. So going back to what I mentioned and helping them sort of draw that line in the sand, if you will, and determining, as far as their infrastructure is concerned, as far as their environment is concerned, as far as their policies, their contracts, and really starting from the bare essentials, if you will, and then being able to use a methodology and being able to use best practices and determine where the gaps are and ultimately what needs to be filled. In any GDPR exercise, it's going to be sort of different depending on the organization and as far as their risk of appetite is concerned, if you will. Certain areas that are going to need to be looked at prior to other areas. I would argue that no organization, well, I guess no organization, depending on the size, will be fully compliant as far as GDPR is concerned come with May 2018. It's really about understanding what the regulation is about, what it entails, and taking the proper steps to become compliant moving forward. So when the regulator, if the regulator comes knocking on the door, what have you done to basically prepare? What are the plans to ultimately become compliant moving forward? So it's really about understanding where you're at, and then once you've sort of understood that, sort of establishing the information, assessing that information, making a plan, and then ultimately being able to implement that plan moving forward.
Okay, so we're just about at our limit, though. If anybody here has any questions, feel free to send them to either one of us, or both of our email addresses are on the screen. If you'd like to get a copy of the presentation or a copy of the recording, you can reach out to either of us and we will get that to you. Index Engines also has a playbook on our solution that goes into far more depth than what I spoke about in the session. That's available. If you send to myself, Jim McGann, an email, we will get that out to you as soon as possible. If you do have any questions, on the question tab on the right, bottom right, you can type it in there. There are a few coming in. Pav, this first one might probably be for you. Question: do you believe that it is possible for organizations to be fully GDPR compliant by May 2018?
Yeah, I guess I sort of touched upon that. Being GDPR compliant, it's a transformational process, so it's ongoing. It's not sort of an exercise as far as you have boxes, and basically it's a matter of ticking these boxes, and once you're compliant, you're compliant. It's very much an ongoing process, and when we take all the different types of as far as the regulation is concerned and the stipulations and what needs to be done. So I guess, as I sort of mentioned previously, I think it's more about organizations sort of being prepared and sort of understanding where they're currently at and having a plan in place to be able to justify themselves when the regulator comes knocking on the door. So organizations that haven't started sort of their data mapping exercises or their records of processing activities, and being able to determine and where the data resides across the enterprise, what are sort of the processes taking place as far as the data is concerned. These are areas where organizations really need to, if they haven't started, to definitely start the process. And the big one that we've been sort of discussing today as well is this PII information that is scattered, across the enterprise. I was mentioning the file shares and SharePoint sites and etc. that haven't been accessed for years, and there's a high likelihood that there is there is PII information. Out of all the projects that I've done in the past, I've always been able to identify sensitive information, highly confidential information, or some type of personally identifiable information. Yep,
and I think the important point also with that is just getting started is important. As Pav mentioned, starting to put a defensible process in place. And one of the things that we see with Index Engines is customers just starting in small environments and then scaling it up. And it's an easy approach to just getting tackling the large scale problem. It's just starting with highly suspect areas and then growing from there. Another question is, personal data is so broadly defined, and I'm summarizing, how can we find data that doesn't contain typical identifiers? So index engines, there's a lot of capabilities. We didn't have time to go through them today, but there's a lot of different types of search algorithms that are built into the product. So, keyword search obviously can find things like people's names and obvious identifiers, but we have pattern search to look for things like, driver's license numbers based on different countries. And we also have concept search, where you can train the search engine to find data that you don't even know exists, when you don't even know what you're looking for. So it's using conceptual search algorithms. So there's a lot of different search tools that are built in to be able to really find content, even the stuff that's hidden deep in some of these areas, including backup tapes. One other question, Pab, this is probably for you. With regards to where to start, what other areas of an organization should focus on information governance and becoming GDPR compliant?
Right. So I think from a GDPR perspective, or for that matter, from an information governance perspective, the initial assessment and being able to understand where you're at. I think from GDPR, I'm speaking to a lot of organizations, and they haven't really been seeking the legal advice, whether that's internal legal or whether that's their outside legal, and which is a really crucial point. Organizations need to review their policies, they need to review their contracts, all the relationships as far as third-party relationships, or the people that are processing the data if they're a controller. So all this information needs to be reviewed. There's a huge area as far as consent is concerned that the lawyers need to ultimately get involved with, because it needs to be explicit now, and I can sort of go on about that for a while, but I won't. So legal advice is very crucial. Does the organization have any type of GDPR, or for that matter, IG council in place right now? And ultimately, this would be comprised of people across the various stakeholders, which would include security, compliance, legal, IT, records, as well as the business units. I was talking about the building data maps, as well as part of that is the records of processing activities, which is crucial. There's the data privacy impact assessments, as well as data protection impact assessments. So these are areas typically where during an assessment we will review and find out what is being done, and then from there work on that moving forward.
Okay, I'm being told we're finished for today. And if you do have any questions, feel free to reach out to us. We'll be happy to send you further information and speak to you about how you can meet these challenges. Pav, it was great working with you today. Thank you for your time. It was very good content.
Thanks, Jim. Appreciate it. Thank you, everyone.